June 4, 1942, 10:02 hours. The Pacific Ocean, 250 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his flagship, surveying an ocean that belonged to Japan. Around him, three sister carriers, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sliced through calm waters in perfect formation. Together, they formed the Kido Butai, the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. These four carriers had annihilated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They had crushed the British Eastern Fleet. They had conquered an ocean. The morning sun glinted off the Akagi's flight deck, where maintenance crews swarmed over rows of Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, the smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt spray. From his vantage point, Nagumo could see dive bombers being lowered from the hangar deck on massive elevators, their wings folded like roosting birds of prey. Nagumo was 55 years old, a torpedo warfare specialist who had spent 3 decades mastering the art of naval combat. He was methodical, cautious, and deeply experienced. At this moment, he believed he was hours away from destroying the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet. His 4 carriers held 248 aircraft, more than enough to obliterate the estimated 2 American carriers supposedly near Midway. He checked his watch. His strike aircraft would launch within minutes. By noon, Midway Island would be neutralized. By sunset, any American carriers foolish enough to challenge him would rest on the ocean floor. But Nagumo didn't know that American codebreakers had read every message of his battle plan. He didn't know that 3 American carriers, not 2, waited beyond the horizon. And he didn't know that in exactly 5 minutes, his entire world would begin to disintegrate. The catastrophe wouldn't unfold over days or hours. It would happen in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. In 5 minutes, the invincible Kido Butai would transform from predator to prey. In 5 minutes, the course of the Pacific War, perhaps of the entire Second World War, would pivot on a single, impossible stroke of fortune and timing. This is the story of how industrial mathematics, broken codes, and desperate courage converged at a single point in space and time. This is the story of how 4 aircraft carriers representing Japan's entire strategic advantage in the Pacific ceased to exist before their admiral could comprehend what was happening. This is the moment Vice Admiral Nagumo learned that wars are not won by warriors alone, they are won by intelligence, by timing, and by the cold calculus of industrial replacement capacity. The clock read 10:20 hours. 5 minutes remained. To understand the magnitude of what was about to occur, you must first understand what the Kido Butai represented and what it had accomplished in just 6 months of war. On December 7, 1941, these same 4 carriers, along with 2 others, had launched 353 aircraft against Pearl Harbor. They sank 4 battleships, damaged 4 more, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. The attack shattered the myth of American naval invincibility in the Pacific. It was a tactical masterpiece, planned and executed with devastating precision. But Pearl Harbor was just the opening movement. In the months that followed, the Kido Butai had rampaged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans like an unstoppable typhoon. In April 1942, Nagumo's carriers struck Ceylon, sinking the British heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire in minutes. Days later, his aircraft found and destroyed the British aircraft carrier Hermes. The Royal Navy fled westward, ceding the Indian Ocean entirely to Japan. The carrier strike force was Japan's strategic trump card, its answer to overwhelming American industrial capacity. Japan could not match America's ability to produce battleships, cruisers, or destroyers. Japanese shipyards, constrained by limited steel production and a smaller industrial base, could never compete in a tonnage race. But carriers were different. Carriers projected power through aircraft, not through armor and guns. A single well-trained carrier air group could sink ships worth 10 times the carrier's construction cost. Japan's carrier pilots, men like Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida and Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga, were among the most experienced in the world. Many had combat experience dating back to the war in China in 1930. They could hit a moving ship from 10,000 feet, thread torpedo bombers through anti-aircraft fire at wave-top height, and coordinate strikes with ballistic precision. The mathematics seemed favorable. Yes, America could build more ships eventually, but if Japan's carriers destroyed America's carriers first, those future ships would have no air cover. They would be helpless targets. Japan's strategy hinged on a single principle: achieve decisive victory before American industrial power could fully mobilize. By June 1942, that strategy appeared to be working perfectly. But there was a problem Nagumo didn't see: a catastrophic vulnerability hidden within his apparent strength. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized offensive striking power above all else. Hangars were designed to maximize aircraft capacity, not to protect against damage. Fuel lines ran through the ships with minimal armoring. Damage control systems were adequate but not exceptional. Most critically, Japanese carriers lacked the redundancy and compartmentalization of American designs. American carriers like Enterprise and Yorktown had multiple layers of protection: armored flight decks on some classes, extensive firefighting systems, watertight compartments designed to contain flooding and fire. These ships were built with the assumption they would take damage, and they were engineered to survive it. Japanese carriers were built with the assumption they would never be hit. This wasn't arrogance, it was a calculated risk. Japanese naval architects understood the trade-off. Heavier protection meant fewer aircraft, slower speed, or both. In 1942, Japan's strategy was offensive dominance through first strike capability. Hit the enemy before they could hit you. Sink their carriers before they launched their aircraft. The entire edifice of Japanese naval power rested on a single premise: we attack first, we attack hardest, and we never allow the enemy close enough to strike back. On the morning of June 4th, that premise was about to be stress-tested to destruction. Nagumo's carriers were in a vulnerable configuration, a fact he was acutely aware of. His aircraft had just returned from a strike on Midway Island. They needed to be rearmed and refueled. On the hangar decks below, ordnance crews were frantically switching bomb loads. The aircraft that had struck Midway with high-explosive bombs now needed armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes to attack American carriers, whose location had been reported just minutes earlier. The Akagi's hangar deck was a choreographed chaos. Bombs lay on carts, fuel hoses snaked across the deck. Torpedoes rested in their handling cradles. It was a tinderbox. Every carrier was during rearming operations, but Nagumo's combat air patrol of Zero fighters circled overhead. His radar watch, primitive but functional, scanned the skies, and his lookout swept the horizon with binoculars. He believed he had time. American carriers were at least 200 miles away. His scouts had spotted them to the northeast. Even if they launched immediately, their aircraft would take at least 90 minutes to reach the Kido Butai. By then, his own strike would be airborne, his decks would be clear, and his combat air patrol would be reinforced. The mathematics of carrier warfare were simple. The side that struck first won. Nagumo believed he would strike first. He was wrong. At 10:22 hours, 2 minutes past the moment Nagumo checked his watch, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr. led 33 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers in a wide circle 20,000 feet above the Pacific. McCluskey was lost. He commanded Enterprise Air Group, and for the past hour, he had been searching for the Japanese fleet based on outdated position reports. His fuel was critically low. Several of his pilots had already signaled they would have to ditch in the ocean. McCluskey faced a terrible choice: turn back to the Enterprise and accept mission failure, or continue the search and risk losing his entire air group. He chose to continue. Then, at 10:20 hours, he spotted it: a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast, its wake cutting a white line across the blue water. It was the Arashi, departing after depth-charging an American submarine. McCluskey made an intuitive leap. That destroyer was heading back to its fleet. He banked his Dauntless and followed the wake. What happened next would be analyzed, debated, and studied for the next 8 decades. It was a convergence of factors so improbable that if rendered as fiction, it would be dismissed as unrealistic. McCluskey's dive bombers arrived at almost the exact moment that Yorktown's dive bomber squadron, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, approached from a different angle. Neither group knew the other existed. They had launched from different carriers, taken different routes, and by sheer chance both arrived within 2 minutes of each other. Below them, the 4 Japanese carriers were in their most vulnerable configuration. Aircraft crowded the flight decks, fueled and armed. Ordnance lay exposed on the hangars. Fuel lines were pressurized. The carriers had just turned into the wind to launch, presenting their long axes, perfect targets for dive bombing. And the Japanese combat air patrol, over 20 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, was at sea level. Earlier that morning, American torpedo bomber squadrons had attacked the Kido Butai with suicidal courage and almost zero effect. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost all 15 aircraft and 29 of 30 crew. These slow, low-flying Devastator torpedo bombers had been massacred by Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. But their sacrifice was not meaningless. The Zeros, drawn down to wave-top height to slaughter the torpedo bombers, were now 20,000 feet below McCluskey's dive bombers. The Japanese carriers were naked. At 10:22 hours, McCluskey pushed his control stick forward. 33 dauntless dive bombers rolled into 70-degree dives, accelerating toward terminal velocity. The screaming whine of wind through their dive brakes, a sound Japanese sailors would later describe as the shriek of a banshee, announced the arrival of American vengeance. Nagumo, standing on Akagi's bridge, heard the scream. He looked up. The sky was falling. Let me explain what happened in the next 5 minutes with brutal precision, because this is where industrial war doctrine meets mathematical inevitability. 10:22 hours and 30 seconds, the first bombs fell. 3 dauntless bombers from Enterprise's Bombing Squadron 6 dove on Kaga. The first 2 missed their 1,000-pound bombs, throwing up towering waterspouts alongside the carrier's hull. The third bomb struck Kaga's flight deck near the forward elevator. The explosion was catastrophic. The bomb penetrated the wooden flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar where 18 fueled and armed aircraft were packed tightly together. The hangar transformed into an inferno instantly. Fuel ignited. Ordnance cooked off. Torpedoes exploded. The blast tore through the ship's structure like men were incinerated where they stood. Others, engulfed in flames, threw themselves screaming into the ocean. 10:23 hours, Akagi was hit. A single 1,000-pound bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Richard Best, struck the carrier's flight deck near the amidship's elevator. It penetrated into the hangar where the bomb elevators had just lifted 18 armed torpedo bombers. The explosion ignited aviation fuel, which ignited the torpedoes, which detonated the magazine. The blast was so powerful that it buckled Akagi's flight deck upward, lifting the massive armored surface like a blister. Flames shot through every ventilation shaft. The bridge filled with Nagumo staggered, temporarily deafened by the concussion. 10:24 hours, Soryu was hit. 3 bombs, all within 45 seconds, struck the carrier. 1 hit the flight deck. 1 penetrated the hangar. The third struck near the aviation fuel storage. Soryu was the smallest of the 4 carriers, and her damage control crews were excellent. But there is no damage control technique that can contain a fuel-fed inferno spreading at hundreds of degrees per second. Within 90 seconds of the first bomb hit, Soryu's captain knew his ship was lost. 10:25 hours, 3 of the 4 carriers were dying. In less than 5 minutes, American dive bombers had delivered 6 bomb hits, perhaps 8, accounts vary, across 3 Japanese fleet carriers. The bombs themselves were not exceptional weapons. They were standard 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs, the same type dropped on shore targets, but their timing, placement, and the vulnerability of their targets created a cascade effect that no amount of Japanese courage or damage control expertise could arrest. Here's why the damage was irreversible. Japanese carriers stored their aviation fuel in unarmored tanks, distributed throughout the ship. American carriers used armored fuel bunkers positioned to minimize explosion risk. When a bomb struck an American carrier, fuel fires could often be contained. When a bomb struck a Japanese carrier during refueling operations, the entire ship became a fuel-air bomb. Japanese carriers had wooden flight decks covered with thin steel plating, a design that maximized aircraft capacity by keeping topside weight low. American carriers increasingly used armored flight decks, especially on newer designs. A bomb that would crater a Japanese flight deck might bounce off or cause only surface damage to an American carrier. Most critically, Japanese carriers concentrated their aircraft handling on the hangar deck, where planes were fueled, armed, and prepared for launch in a densely packed environment. American carriers spread these operations across multiple decks and spaces. When a Japanese hangar caught fire, it caught completely. When an American hangar caught fire, it could be isolated. At 10:26 hours, Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, surrounded by flames and smoke, watching Kaga and Soryu burn on the horizon. The noise was indescribable. Explosions, screaming metal, men shouting, the roar of the inferno consuming his flagship. His staff begged him to transfer his flag to a cruiser. Nagumo refused. He stood frozen, watching his career, his command, and Japan's strategic advantage in the Pacific disintegrate in real time. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, survived, but only for a few more hours. That afternoon, American dive bombers from Enterprise found her and delivered 4 bomb hits. By evening, all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai were... Let me give you the final numbers, because they tell the story of industrial asymmetry more clearly than any narrative can. Japanese losses at Midway: 4 fleet carriers, sunk. 1 heavy cruiser, sunk. 248 carrier aircraft, destroyed. 3,057 men, killed. 6 months of carrier pilot training and combat experience. Irreplaceable American losses at Midway. Yorktown: 1 destroyer, sunk. 145 aircraft, destroyed. 307 men, killed. But here's the statistic that mattered most. In June 1942, the United States had 11 fleet carriers under construction in American shipyards. Japan had 2. The Yorktown, sunk at Midway, would be replaced by a new Yorktown commissioned in April 1943. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu would never be replaced. Japan lacked the industrial capacity, the steel production, the shipyard infrastructure, and the time to rebuild its carrier fleet. Nagumo survived Midway. He transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara and sailed back to Japan in shame. 2 years later, facing defeat on Saipan, he would commit suicide. But on June 4, 1942, standing in the flames of his flagship, he already knew the war was lost. The Battle of Midway is remembered as a turning point, the moment Japan's offensive momentum stalled and American fortunes reversed. But that framing misses the deeper truth. Midway didn't change the Pacific War's trajectory, it revealed it. The war was lost the moment Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, because the attack triggered an industrial avalanche Japan could never outrun. Let me show you the mathematics. In 1941, Japan's steel production was approximately 6.8 million tons per year. The United States produced 75.5 million tons. That's an 1-to-1 advantage. Steel is the foundation of industrial warfare. It becomes ships, tanks, aircraft, guns, and ammunition. No amount of tactical brilliance can compensate for an 1-to-1 disadvantage in the fundamental building block of modern war. Japan's entire shipbuilding capacity, every naval yard, every commercial yard, every dry dock, could produce approximately 600,000 tons of shipping per year at wartime peak production. The United States, by 1943, was producing 19 million tons of shipping per year from yards that hadn't even existed in 1940. Consider aircraft production. In 1942, Japan produced approximately 8,800 military aircraft. The United States produced 47,800. By 1944, American production would reach 96,300 aircraft in a single year, more than Japan would produce during the entire war. But the true asymmetry wasn't just in production numbers. It was in the philosophy of replacement. Japanese military doctrine, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition and Bushido philosophy, emphasized the irreplaceable value of elite warriors. A veteran Zero pilot with 500 combat hours was a precious asset, almost impossible to replace. Japanese pilot training programs produced approximately 100 new carrier pilots per year. They were excellent, perhaps the best in the world in 1941. But they were few. American doctrine treated pilots as replaceable components in an industrial system. American pilot training programs expanded from producing 300 pilots per year in 1939 to producing 96,000 pilots per year by 1943. The individual American pilot in 1942 was less experienced, less skilled, less elite than his Japanese counterpart. But there were dozens of American pilots for every Japanese pilot, and here's the cruel mathematics. Even mediocre pilots can sink a carrier if they outnumber the defenders 1-0 to 1. After Midway, Japan attempted to rebuild its carrier fleet. The Taiho was commissioned in 1944, a superb ship, possibly the finest carrier design Japan ever produced. She was sunk by a single American submarine torpedo on her first combat operation. The Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, was the largest carrier ever built at that time. She was sunk by an American submarine while still on her shakedown cruise, Meanwhile, America commissioned the Essex-class carriers. The first, Essex herself, was commissioned in December 1942, just 6 months after Midway. She was followed by Lexington, Bunker Hill, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, Hancock. The names march on. 24 Essex-class carriers were commissioned during the war. They were mass-produced fleet carriers, 27,000 tons each, built in an average of 16 months from keel laying to commissioning. Japan couldn't sink them as fast as America could build them, but the asymmetry went deeper than ships and aircraft. It extended to the economic systems that produced them. The United States entered World War II with massive unutilized industrial capacity, a legacy of the Great Depression. American factories were producing consumer goods at a fraction of their potential output. When war came, those factories converted to military production without building new facilities. Ford's Willow Run plant, which we covered in a previous video, was producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes by 1944. That's not exceptional wartime production, that's just American industrial capacity running at something approaching full utilization. Japan had no such reserve capacity. Japanese industry was already running at near maximum output before the war started. Japanese factories were smaller, older, and more specialized than American factories. Japanese manufacturing relied heavily on skilled labor and artisanal techniques. American manufacturing relied on semi-skilled labor, standardization, and mass production. When a Japanese carrier burned at Midway, it took 30 months to replace, if it could be replaced at all. When an American carrier was damaged, it steamed to Pearl Harbor, was repaired in weeks, and returned to combat. The Battle of Midway was the moment this mathematical reality became visible. American codebreakers, operating IBM tabulating machines in a basement in Hawaii, read Japanese naval codes and predicted Nagumo's exact objective route and timing. American intelligence outthought Japanese operational security through systematic industrial-scale cryptanalysis. American dive bomber pilots, many on their first combat mission, destroyed 4 fleet carriers through a combination of courage, training, and sheer numerical advantage. American industrial capacity outproduced Japanese craftsmanship through assembly line standardization. American strategy: replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them, outsustained Japanese strategy of elite forces achieving decisive victory. Vice Admiral Nagumo, standing in the flames of the Akagi, wasn't just witnessing 4 carriers burn, he was witnessing the collision of 2 industrial philosophies, and watching his philosophy lose. The Japanese believed warriors won wars. The Americans believed factories won wars. At Midway, the factories proved right. Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi survived the Battle of Midway, but his reputation did not. He was quietly reassigned to shore duty, then given command of land-based forces on Saipan in 1944. When American forces overran the island in July 1944, Nagumo committed suicide rather than face capture. His legacy is complicated. Western histories often portray him as indecisive or incompetent, a man paralyzed by bad luck at Midway. Japanese histories are more nuanced. Nagumo was a competent, cautious commander, thrust into a role that demanded aggressive risk-taking. He was a destroyer and cruiser specialist asked to command carriers. He won victories at Pearl Harbor and Ceylon not because he was a brilliant carrier tactician, but because his subordinates, men like Mitsuo Fuchida, were exceptional. At Midway, Nagumo made decisions that seemed reasonable given the information he possessed. He prioritized neutralizing Midway's airfield before hunting American carriers. He armed his aircraft for a second strike on Midway when reports indicated the island's defenses were still operational. He reacted to the American carrier sighting by rearming his aircraft for naval strike, a time-consuming process, but the correct tactical choice. His mistake wasn't tactical, it was strategic. He believed the war was winnable through tactical excellence. He believed Japan's superior warrior spirit could compensate for inferior industrial capacity. He believed that sinking 1 or 2 American carriers would demoralize America into accepting Japanese dominance of the Pacific. He was wrong on all counts. The Battle of Midway claimed 3,057 Japanese lives. Many died in the initial bomb hits, incinerated instantly or killed by blast overpressure. Others died in the hours that followed, trapped in flooded compartments or consumed by fires that raged beyond any possibility of control. Some survived the sinking of their ships, only to perish in the ocean, either from exposure, exhaustion, or wounds. Japanese destroyers rescued 1097 survivors from the 4 carriers. The loss of the carriers themselves was strategically devastating, but the loss of experienced air crews was catastrophic. Japan lost 121 pilots and air crew at Midway, men with hundreds of combat hours, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Ceylon, and the East Indies campaign. These men were irreplaceable. Japan's pilot training programs couldn't produce replacement pilots of equivalent skill in time to matter. By contrast, when Yorktown sank at Midway, most of her crew was rescued. When her aircraft were lost, the pilots, if they survived, were reassigned to other carriers. American industrial capacity could replace carriers faster than Japan could sink them, and American training programs could replace pilots faster than Japan could kill them. The mathematics of attrition warfare are brutal and simple. If you cannot replace losses faster than your enemy can inflict them, you lose. Japan couldn't replace losses. America could, and did. After Midway, Japan never again attempted a major carrier operation. The Imperial Japanese Navy shifted to defensive operations, trying to preserve its remaining strength. But preservation is not a winning strategy. While Japan's carriers hid, America's multiplied. By November 1943, American carriers raided Rabaul with impunity. By June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American forces deployed 15 carriers against Japan's 9. The result was the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a massacre where American fighters shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The Kido Butai, the force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, no longer existed. In its place was the U.S. Fast Carrier Task Force, a fleet so large it operated as multiple independent groups, each larger than Japan's entire remaining carrier fleet. The lesson of Midway echoes beyond World War II. It's a lesson about industrial warfare, about the limits of tactical excellence, and about the mathematics of replacement and attrition. Elite forces cannot defeat mass production. Warrior ethos cannot defeat industrial systems. Tactical brilliance cannot defeat strategic sustainability. In 5 minutes on June 4, 1942, 4 aircraft carriers burned. But the real story isn't about those 5 minutes. It's about the years of decisions, investments, and industrial development that made those 5 minutes inevitable. Japan built a navy of warriors. America built a navy of factories. At Midway, the factories won. If you found this deep dive into industrial warfare and the mathematics of naval combat compelling, consider subscribing. We explore the hidden calculations that decided history's greatest conflicts, the stories where logistics defeated courage, where production lines triumphed over front lines, and where industrial capacity reshaped the world. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what other turning point battles should we analyze through the lens of industrial mathematics? The Battle of Midway wasn't won by 5 minutes of luck. It was won by years of industrial preparation, and that story, the story of how factories, shipyards, and training programs won the Pacific War before the first shot was fired, is the story that truly deserves to be told.